Hello, welcome to our radio course week 3 lecture. And today we're going to be talking about radio interviews. And there are so many different types of radio interviews, and we can't possibly cover everything today. So we've tried to break this down into some principles. But of course, whether you're interviewing in a way where you're looking for clips of people, so you as the interviewer won't be in it at all, or whether you're interviewing somebody important and you've only got 3 minutes, like a politician or a celebrity, or whether you're doing a long interview to get someone to tell a very personal story in a very emotional way, are all going to change the techniques and things that you adopt here. And we'll try to address a few of those, but it's important we get started somewhere. And so that's what we're going to try to do today. And there is years and years and years of learning and practice to get this right, because not only have you got equipment to get used to and be monitoring the sound to make sure you've got an amazingly clear recording, but you've also got to have emotional intelligence to be really listening and thinking about what people are saying. So your brain's got to be doing quite a lot of things at once. And so practice and practice and practice is what will finally get you there. So let's start and go through some of the things that we'd like to share with you about how to approach an interview and how to do a good interview. So let's start about the things you need to think about long before you get to actually doing your interview, which is all about how you find a good interviewee. That's going to depend on the sort of program you're doing. You might just have one person whose story you're going to tell, and that's your one interview. Or you might be able to select a number of interviews to help tell a story. And you might be talking to a lot of people to try and find the exact person that you need to help you explain what happened. And as you're talking to people, think about how they sound, what their voice sounds like, whether they're going to tell it in an interesting way, whether they're going to make people smile, and those sorts of things. Again, for some documentaries and podcasts, you might be needing a politician or somebody important, and that may be very much part of the story, and that will be a slightly different style of interview, perhaps. And also, if you are having more than one interviewee, think about balancing a range of voices. Especially these days, avoid all white men, but try and make sure if you can that they don't all sound the same and that you bring a variety of voices to it, because that's, again, more interesting for you to listen to. And this is incredibly important in discussion programs where you might have a presenter leading a discussion with 4 or 5 people on the table. So one of the programs we asked you to listen to was a program called The Reunion. And for that, you've got to have a range of voices and people sounding different, or it gets very confusing.
And offering different points of view.
Yeah.
So if there are 2 sides to an argument, then you need to make sure that you're representing both sides of your argument. But those are for a particular kind of documentary that is journalistic based. We're not talking so much about the immersive storytelling, retelling kind of documentary experience.
Great. So when you've found your interviewee or interviewees, you next need to think about where you're going to interview them. And if you were making a film, you'd think about a location that looks really impressive or feels right for the story. But for radio, you can also think about a place where actually the story took place, because that can add some drama to it. But you've also got to think about what that location sounds like. So somewhere exciting but noisy might cause you total nightmares with editing. So you've got to really think, and when you go to a place and want to sort of understand how an interview is going to sound there, you've got to listen out for fridges, air conditioning, music, all the things that would make it difficult for you to do the interview there. And I want to share with you a story of something I got horribly wrong earlier in my career, where I decided to do a program that was all about how an area in the southwest of England called Cornwall was going to be turned into a new Silicon Valley because of fast broadband. It was a business program. And so we were interviewing various small businesses that had left places cities like London and were moving to Cornwall to be by the sea, where they could go surfing before breakfast and then run their business online. This was years and years ago, when most people didn't have fast broadband that we all have now. And we wanted it to feel like you were really in Cornwall, and Cornwall has beautiful beaches and is by the sea. So we decided to do, it was a discussion program. We decided to record it at a hotel in Newquay, which is a big surfer beach overlooking the beach, and it looked fabulous. And we had our discussion about how amazing it was for people to go surfing in the morning before they did their work. I got back to edit it, and all I could hear was this white noise in the background, which was what the sea actually sounds like when you record it from above a cliff. And I was horrified, and we ended up having to add some sound effects, actually of water on a pebbly beach at the beginning, to make it sound like the sea at all. And we'll talk more about that in next week's lecture, of how many things don't sound like they do. But it's one really to be aware of for this. Actually recording someone somewhere quiet and adding some sound later is probably your best bet. So anything else to say on where to do an interview, Jane?
I think you've covered that off. When you look at this PowerPoint, you'll see that we've talked later about recording atmosphere or wild track. So what Zilla would have done with her surfing program now is record it probably in a quiet room where everyone was relaxed and comfortable, but then go out and collect some exterior sounds of gulls and sea, and add those across the back of it later. So that's one of the things to remember. Wherever you are, record some wild track, atmosphere, sometimes known as B-roll, to not only help smooth out any edits. You won't need that, but it does happen, that it helps to just smooth things together, but mainly to give you that sense of place and of being there, because that's what you're looking for, is to take people with you to another place.
However, I should say it is always better to interview someone in a place where they feel comfortable telling the story than it ever will be doing it on Zoom. There is something about or taking people into a studio. There is something about recording people in a place where they feel comfortable, which gets people more relaxed and comfortable.
And also, ordinarily, we talk a lot about maintaining eye contact with that person, but sometimes, if the story is so deep and so personal, it's actually much better to record them as side by side if you're walking along. Some people need to be on the move to be able to get out the really difficult stuff, or doing washing up, or something that helps them to relax enough to tell you what's really going on inside of them. The other trick, of course, if you are asking them to retell, is to allow them to open a photograph album or to look at pictures, because sometimes if they're talking about loss or grief or something, looking at the picture of the lost person is another technique to enable them to get over the hurdle. Of course, if you're interviewing politicians or some celebrities, then you have a completely different set of problems, because what you're trying to do is to get them off the ready-made soundbite, off the usual press button and out it comes, trying to get behind. So trying to find unusual ways to just get them to think slightly differently, and to notice that you are actually asking them fresh questions about something that they're used to churning out platitudes about.
Great. So you've got your interviewee, you've worked out where you want to do it. Then you need to do more research, because you need to make sure you've absolutely pinned down everything you want them to say before you can start planning what you want to do in terms of the questions you want to ask. And that involves really thinking through the path you want to do. So even if you're doing and you're just getting clips from somebody that you're going to intersperse in a documentary, the way you order the questions and the way you pace an interview will all make a difference in how they tell that story, and how good the material you record is. So even if you're not planning to use your interview as a sort of 5-minute section with you asking questions, really the same rules apply about how to work out the order of those questions. Usually avoid a straight chronological thing, try and sort of make it more interesting than that, and think through what will make it interesting for your listeners. What do they want to know? How are you going to bring that all to life? And that's your job doing the interview. So the big questions to remember are what, when, where, and why. And I'm going to hand over to you again, Jane, just to elaborate a little bit on the sort of thinking you need to do to start structuring the sort of questions that are going to give you the amazing material you need to make a documentary.
What you've got to avoid doing is getting your interviewee to spill the beans before you've even switched off the tape. So they, you know, if they've told you the whole story over the phone before the interview, then if you start asking the same questions, you won't get the same response, because they will, even if they're not actually saying the words, that they'll be giving you a look as like, yeah, but you know that. Yeah, but you know that. We know that. So you have to strike a balance between making sure you've got your facts right and not enabling them to download everything they wanted to say on the subject. Again, I'm talking about interviewing people like Zilla and I, rather than your celebrities and your politicians, people who are not used to being interviewed about their lives. And then the first question you ask is going to be a gently ease you in kind of question, which you probably won't use. You may be, but you know, as long as it's not live, and just thinking this is just a way to make them understand it's not quite as scary as they think it's going to be. The other trick, well, I use the word trick, I should use the word technique. It's not a trick, but it is quite good to remind your interviewee, if you need to ask really difficult questions of them, warn them in advance. Just don't tell them what the questions are. Just say, because I am here to ask the questions that the audience would be screaming at their radios or, you know, into their smartphones to have answers to, I'm going to have to ask them, you know, be real devil's advocate. I'm going to have to ask you some really difficult questions because I need to be fair to my audience. Remember, it's that triangle of fairnesses that we looked at in the last lecture. And usually people are just like, oh, fine, okay, I understand that. Yeah. You've got to, at some point in my new lifestyle, ask whether or not I've had the op or something like that. You know, it's, people rarely react badly to that. They get it. You've got to ask difficult questions. How you do it is the key. And yes, it's, I'm just looking at to see what else we haven't covered.
Well, we'd say bullet points. We say we'd never recommend you write down full questions.
Never write down your questions. Never sit there and go, yes, on the 13th of July, 1997, you were seen in the street. And, you know, what were you doing there at that time? No, that doesn't work. The main point is, in actual fact, it's not the questions that matter, it's the answers that you get. So you want to have bullet points that say, need to find out where they were on that date and at that time. Don't worry about how you ask the question, just make sure you are getting the answer that you need. And as Zilla said, just have the bullet points and of where you want to go and what you need to have recorded before you get up and walk away.
And we've also would advise you not to send questions. People will, somebody ask for it, just send topics that you'll cover, largely because sometimes people try to prepare, and you will sometimes find people come to the interview with something written out. And I would always say, please put it down. We'll make it easy for you. You don't need it, because as soon as somebody sounds like they're using their reading voice, it's not going to sound like a conversation. And so everything we talked about, the voice and the need for that natural sounding voice, will be destroyed. And the last thing is the practical planning. I'm not going to go through those in detail because you can read them. You've got to make sure you've got all the right kit, and that your batteries are charged, and you've got spare batteries, that you've got space on your SD card, and that you have absolutely made clear to your interviewee what time it's going to be, where it's going to be, and text again to remind them. Be relentless about that and make sure that that happens. And if you ever work on live programs, half your time is just reminding people, hope everything's all right for the interview tomorrow, because if you're running a live program and your guests don't turn up, it's a very scary situation indeed. But I'd recommend, again, all that sort of discipline of reminding people, make sure you've been absolutely clear. So let's move on to the next thing, which is, again, at this point, you're ready, you got there, and you're about to do the interview. And the first thing I want to say is get there early, say that you're not in a panic, because if you're in a panic and you've got stressed because you're half an hour late and you've had to text them to say, I'm sorry, I'm late, your heart will be going like this. You'll be a bit stressed and tense, and you want your interviewee to be relaxed. You have got to be relaxed to do a good interview. So you need to be calm. You need to make sure you're breathing. It is deep, proper breathing. You may need to make sure your shoulders aren't like this, and you need to make sure your jaw's not all tense. All those physical things that we do when we're tense, you need to suddenly take a quick check and see, you know, am I a bit tense here? And there's some various techniques that different presenters and people use that are very quick, that you can use to sort of help you calm down and relax. I'm going to pass that over to you, Jane.
Well, I just say 3 breaths. If you just breathe in.
Deep, deep, deep.
Deep, deep, deep. One, count to 5, hold it for 5, and consciously drop your shoulders while you're holding your breath. And then the trick is then to breathe out, counting to 6. So you breathe very, very slowly out. You do that 3 times and it's a great resetter.
Yeah, and I confess to you that in the first lecture we did, I broke my own rules. I was slightly panicked because of doing a first Zoom lecture. And when I listened to it back, I was snatching in breaths like that and making every mistake. And we all do that when we're a bit stressed. So it's something you have to do for the rest of your lives. And it's good for lots of other situations too, apart from doing radio interviews. So depending on the style of interview you're doing, you might well go set up the equipment before you go in, so you can record yourself saying, oh, hello, I'm Zilla and I'm here to do the interview with you, and get some of that snatch. It depends on the style of interviews. You probably wouldn't do that with a politician, because you would it wouldn't be appropriate. But for lots of the sort of things you probably want to do on this course, get that recorder out and capture some initial sound of you meeting and greeting them.
Yes, if the whole point of your interview is to capture character, that comes out in the utterances and the little happenings between the words. And a lot of the material that we've selected for you to listen to, we've selected because the creative audio maker has managed to capture some of the size and the little moments in, for example, leaving home, which I think is on your listening list. The protagonist's wife, Jo, is feeding the dog, and she go like, there you go, Nippy Knox. And suddenly you get their home set up, you get their environment, you get the nickname for the dog, you're there. And this is what you're trying to bring to your audience.
And then it's your job to put them at ease. So have a friendly chat. Again, ask them, if you're in their house, compliment something and say, yes, oh, those flowers look lovely. Where did you get them from? Use techniques that will put people at ease, build trust, and look around you, because you might get other ideas for the interview. You might see an object or something that relates to what you're talking about, or a photograph of somebody that you're talking about, and all those things might start a little conversation that then you might be able to add it to your interview. Don't talk about the things you're going to talk about in the interview directly, because otherwise if you rehearse them, it could sound like that. It won't feel fresh. So try and talk about other things.
Yes, it's a very good point that in the example that we're listening to this week, The Day They Made It Rain, there's a guy called Ray Davey, and I was using the technique I explained earlier for getting him to look at photographs, and he was embarrassed because the photographs were very dirty. And he was like, and I said, tell me, why did you never, you know, why are they dirty? What happened there? Just describe it. And he's reliving it as his hand is trying to brush off the mud. And he was like, oh, sticky, horrible, smelly, dirty mud. And it's taken him right back to the night of this catastrophic flood in which 35 villages in a small community on the north coast of Devon lost their lives. And they were, most of them, they were his friends, they were his relations, they were his workmates.
Thank you, Jane. So there's an example of something that only came through being there, that you sort of picked up on and noticed. We've made a little video on how to sit for an interview. You might have to modify it a little because of COVID right now, but have a look at that. And then before you start the proper interview, just check again that your contributor is comfortable. Do they need a glass of water? Do they need to go to the loo? And then sit down and check again that your shoulders are relaxed, that you're sitting in a nice relaxed way, and start asking those questions.
And check that is anybody about to burst through the door? Do they need to go and attend? Are kids due back from school? Is somebody coming back from work? So are they going to be interrupted? Are they worrying about the clock? Just make sure that they really do have the time you need for this.
So now we're going to talk about just a little bit more on questions, because you've got your bullet points, but we're going to go back in again and focus on open and closed questions, a little bit more detail as you're phrasing them in response to what people are saying. So closed questions are yes or no answers, and they're occasionally they're very useful. And if you're actually putting someone to test and really checking, so did you do it or didn't you? You know, you can use a closed question to force an answer, but generally open questions are what gets everyone engaged and talking. And little techniques like tell me what happened, what did you see, how did it feel, what did you think at the time? All those sorts of questions will be really useful. And little techniques that you can use, sometimes just a little question like why. The fewer words you use sometimes for your questions, the more you'll get people talking. And again, in one of the videos we've got, you know, one of the ways you'll do that is through smiling and looking at them. We'll look a bit more about that in a moment. So use short questions. The worst interviews I've done are when I've had very, very clever people come in to do interviews and they want to sound extremely clever. And this is you often get this if you're using lawyers as presenters and then they're interviewing a judge or somebody very senior in the legal profession, and they want to sound super clever. Yes. And so they'll start saying what they know in the question, and that's not what you need. Your research and everything that goes into that is really important, but your job is not to show people what you know.
You have to stop them and say, you're not answering to impress your colleagues, you're answering. See if you're explaining this to your kid or to your mum or to your mate down the pub. You are not trying to impress people who you think will be listening, who will be impressed. They'll already be impressed because they're being interviewed by you've chosen them for this interview. Yeah.
And then you wanted to talk about another example, did you, Jane, from the book?
Yes, I want to pick up on what you just said about picking up on to prove that you have listened, because people respond and are really encouraged if you pick up a phrase or a word or a little factoid that they have said and you repeat it or you work it into your next question. And showing that you are listening does reveal often the heart of a story. I'll never forget a woman who I was interviewing in it was a very bog standard, I'd say, interview about different reasons why people chose to emigrate to Australia in the 1950s and 60s. And it was a going back kind of piece, really, really standard and not terribly interesting. And this woman was talking about her experience, and she just mentioned it was very hard leaving and then she changed the subject and talked about something completely different. And I thought, very hard leaving the very hard leaving the boy, very hard leaving the baby. Maybe there was a baby. Maybe she had, she wasn't married. I knew that when she first arrived in Australia. I thought, I'm just going to ask you. And I just said, did you have to leave the baby behind? And she looked, she just like, how the hell did you know that? And I said, you just told me. You just, and then it all came out. And that there had been, it was the 1950s, and there was this big shame, and she had to be disappeared off. And suddenly the story changed, and it became a heartbreaking interview of loss and departure. She had to leave her baby behind, being cared for by somebody else, start a new life. It totally transformed the story. It was just a hunch. It was just because she was trying not to say something, but she wanted me to know.
Oh, that sounds, well, that's a very good lesson to listen and just follow up. So that's what we're going on to next, is active listening. So what's critical, especially when you're doing radio, is that you are looking at people. You don't want to be having, when you're talking to someone in a normal conversation, you might be going, and using your voice. And especially if you're on the phone, you have to do that, or people don't realize that you're still listening. But if you do that in a radio interview, if you're going to keep your questions in, it can be very annoying. But at worst, if you're not wanting to be part of it, you've got your voice there over it, and it totally wrecks it. So what you do in a radio interview is look at people, smile at them, encourage them, use your eyebrows, nod your head, and really, it's also important, again, that even though you're monitoring the sound and thinking about lots of things and having to think, oh, what am I going to ask them next and everything else, that you look calm and relaxed and open to talk to. So again, we've got back to that sort of open posture, looking relaxed, eye contact, and nodding, which is a thing radio producers do a lot to encourage people. Keep talking. Yes, this is great. I'm listening. I'm really enjoying this, without using your voice. And we're going to do a short exercise on active listening in the seminar, because I think in these days when we're always talking to people on our phones and doing other things, it's a good thing to practice, and it's a good skill to just sort of be very, very aware of. And we've got a little bit more on listening here, because listening is also not only encouraging them to speak, but is also going to help you ask the next question and give you time to sort of think about how to do it. So there's a little interview example here of somebody that didn't quite listen to what was going on before and potentially could have missed a big story. So the interviewer in this says, so Jane, why don't you play the contributor? So when did you first become interested in music?
Well, I went on this amazing Tibetan retreat for 3 years.
So why the clarinet? And I hope you gathered from that if I'd said, Jane, that sounds interesting. How did that? So what did you learn there? It would have been a far more interesting interview. Instead, I killed Jane dead with my moving on to a question that I'd probably written before. It didn't relate to anything she'd said, so it was boring to listen to, and probably makes her feel a bit rubbish that I'm not actually interested in what she's saying, and would certainly be far less interesting for the audience. So the trick is not to rush. You can pause. People might keep speaking. You can breathe. You can just nod and say, You don't have to rush. Sometimes when there's silence to fill, your interviewee will keep talking and say something even better than what you heard before. And a few minutes pause. Yeah.
Use that. Use the power of silence. And we'll just sit back and just wait. You can do that too.
And you've got the pause for you to think about what you need to say and how to respond, because you have got to be, you know, there is a lot, as I've said, you're doing a lot. Your brain is having to work in many ways at once to do this, while your face is just showing that you're calm and completely collected. So that's listening, which is just as important as the questions you ask, and will inform the questions you ask, and will change everything about the interview. And we've got a little exercise here for you to have a little think about. And these were interviewing children is particularly hard. You have to be really good to get them to talk. And some people are brilliant at it and just get people to feel really comfortable and get kids talking. And when an interview with a child is really good, it can be really uplifting, it can be funny, it can make people smile, and it can make their day. And equally, if an interview is about a tragic event with a child, it can, break people's heart and make them want to do something to bring about change. But it's not easy. And one of the tendencies, because interviewers get a bit scared about interviewing children, is to not really ask questions and to almost give them the answers. So here's some questions here, which we'd like you to, we'll read them out, but then I'd like you to just maybe stop the video for a few minutes and just not note down in a notebook a few different ways of asking these questions. So the first is, so you've been walking out of school for the last 29 weeks. Is there a time in the day when you walk out? Your education's been disrupted every week. So it's been worth it as far as you're concerned? That's not really a question at all. And your parents support you doing this?
So it's a mix of telling the 10-year-old what they already know. It's not telling the audience anything they need to know, and closed questions. Yes or no, the parents are, or they're not, but it doesn't get to the heart of the story. I mean, you will be completely forgiven for not having a clue what the story is about and the nub of it and the motivation. And
yeah, so the why is missing. Why are you doing this?
Yeah. And why are you doing it?
So that's a very good example. But now what we'd like to go on to show you and for you to have a listen to is an example of somebody doing this better. And this particular example was even harder because this was done live on radio, which again, when you're interviewing a child, is even more scary because you've got, if you're doing it live, you've obviously got a particular time slot that you've also got to shape the interview in. So we're going to play a little interview by Mike Thompson, who happens to be, I should mention.
The reason I have access is that it just so happens that I've been married to the guy for 30 years. So I can go into his bottom drawer and pull out examples that I think will be helpful to you. And just to set this up, Mike was working as a radio reporter down in Bristol, and the 9 o'clock news, as then was, wanted an interview with a little boy called Jamie, who was only 6 years old. And he'd done an incredible thing and saved his little friend Stephen's life from a paedophile who that day had just been convicted of abducting children from the street. And Jamie had prevented Stephen, age 6 as well, from being abducted. Now, Mike was told he had 1.5 minutes in which to interview a child who Mike had to get a rapport with and get a lot of information across. So he had to open up a conversation. And then when he saw the clock ticking to the conclusion, he had to finish the conversation and bring it to some kind of resolution. So have a listen and count for me what were the open questions and what were the closed questions, and what were the, we would call, affirmation statements that encourage somebody to reflect on what they've just said.
Stephen was playing with Sean and I was by the pushchair. The man came along and he took Stephen's hand, and I went up to the man and kicked him and took Stephen off of the man. And then Stephen came back to the Sean and played with him, and no one was there.
But what made you suspicious that this man wasn't a nice man?
Because he grabbed Stephen's hand and pulled him to the gate.
What did Stephen do?
He just pushed him, but he didn't go away, so I just went up and kicked him, and then he went away.
Did Stephen call for help?
No, he didn't, because I went up, so he didn't have to call for help.
Were you frightened?
No, I wasn't frightened at all.
Not even a little bit?
No, I wasn't. Because I'm always brave sometimes.
You're always brave sometimes.
Yes, I am.
So Jane, what sort of techniques were used to get Jamie talking so eloquently?
Well, to start off with, there were open questions that enabled Jamie to tell the story as he saw it. So what made you suspicious that this man wasn't a nice man? What did Stephen do? And then you have to move it along a bit. So we have some closed questions like, did Stephen call for help? Were you frightened? And then, no, I wasn't frightened. And then the pro, but not even a little bit. No, well, I suppose I'm always brave sometimes. And that is a delightful ending, which Mike was able to pick up on. So you're always brave sometimes. And then bing, end of conversation and back to the news and weather. So I think it's a kind of mini masterclass in structuring an interview.
Okay, after the interview, you've recorded your interview and you're pleased with it. First thing you do, you check the recording's okay on your headphones. You check it's all right, because if it's not, you're going to need to do it again. So that's the first thing to do. And then the next thing is record some wild track, because as Jane said earlier, if you need to have a little bit of the atmosphere of the room to put in a little pause or something's not quite working, and we'd usually say a minute. Is that right, Jane? That's what I would do, about a minute of sound, which sometimes you have to count for because it seems a really long time.
It really does.
Nothing's happened. So make sure you get that. You won't regret it. That there'll be a time when you record an interview and you just need it.
And you're going to say to us, well, we can loop it, only do 20 seconds. And fine, if you've only got 20 seconds, then get 20 seconds. But it's amazing how quickly you've got any distinguishing sound in that 20 seconds. By the fifth time, the listeners heard it come round, even if consciously they don't know what they're listening to, subconsciously, they're going to be a bit fed up with it.
So that's the next thing you do. Then you've got your recording. I'll talk about the consent form in a minute, but as soon as you can, get that copied onto your computer and backed up, because again, you know, for whatever reason, you just need a backup of that interview somewhere as soon as you can. Your recorder could get stolen, who knows, all sorts of things can happen. The HD disc could be corrupted. We've heard, it's all happened to us. So we know. Then consent forms. So if you're doing programs for, it depends who it is, but you may well have a simple consent form to say that the person you interviewed is happy for you to use that interview. We're going to talk actually in our last lecture a bit more about ethics and the sort of things that you have to deal with contributors. So we'll save that for then, because we don't want to sort of bombard you with too much information at this stage, but this is when you would ask them to sign something. And thank them, a really big thank you. This has been brilliant. I'd always email and thank the next day, but there's some things you don't want to do. And people will always say, well, when's the program coming out? What's happening? And we'd advise, again, with years of experience of doing this, not to overpromise on that, because things can change and then it can make things difficult. So we'd always say it's not clear yet, and find ways to do that. And especially if you're doing an interview earlier on in the process, you know, there is a chance you might not use that interview. Either somebody better might come along, or it might not work in the end to tell your story. So we'd advise, again, being a little bit vague about that, just thanking people for their wonderful contribution, and that you'll let them know in time when the program's going out or what it's going to be used for. And then you should follow up on that. That's the thing you've got to do when you make a promise like that. It is up to you in 6 months' time or a year's time to make sure that you followed through on that. But you know, the most annoying thing is people who say that and then don't actually follow it up. And I know lots of stories of news reporters, especially, who've been amazing at following up and have got extraordinary stories through having followed up. People who followed migrants from Syria and then caught up with them again in Hungary and then caught up with again in Germany. So looking after the people who've helped you and retaining their information and emailing them will all be to your benefit in the long term too, for these sorts of stories. The last thing to just mention again, in terms of if you were using an interview, not cut down into chunks, but as a separate piece, is you're going to need to write a cue. And the exercise we're setting this week, which we're going to put on the Moodle and discuss in the seminar, you'll have to write a cue. So the cue is the sentences that you read as presenter that set it up. And you'd usually do it afterwards, because you know, once you've cut down your interview, you know what's going to be in it. You've got to hook people in and make it exciting, make people think they're privileged to be listening to this person and it's going to tell them something really interesting. It's also how you introduce that person and say who they are and what role they have in this. But you've got to be really careful about not overloading people with information. And 3 to 4 sentences is the most you've got to do. So it's got to be just the right information to give people what they need to understand what's going on. But not too much to overload them. So it teases it up nicely. So listen out when you're listening to any broadcast radio for how people do that for interviews and how they do it, and especially in news, because it's, you know, news have to do it all the time. And they have to do so many, they're not always the most creative cues, but it's probably the best place to learn. So let's talk now. We're going to have a little case study with some of the many different types of interviews that Jane had to do for the day they made it rain. And as you know this program so well from having had to listen to it and make your own version, we thought this was a good one to talk about. So how would you categorize the range of sort of interviews you had to do for this? What sort of things were you looking at, Jane?
We had to start with the survivor. We had to find out why this mattered. And we had to find out from real people who were there, who lost people they loved in that Lynmouth flood. And they required all the gentleness and time. They required the sitting for a long time with cups of tea and with getting the photograph albums out, walking round the gravestones, all of that. Then we had to
help them to paint pictures of how awful the flood was.
Take them back there and help them to tell us what it was like, the smell of it, the look of it, and why it mattered to them.
Mm-hmm.
Then we had to tackle all the various officials involved, those at the Ministry of Defence, those at the Air Force, those in Parliament, local MPs, and for them we had to have a real cast iron. We had to have all our facts lined up ready in a row, so we knew when they started to deviate from the story that we knew to be true, then we could suspect that they were trying to spin us a line if we could get the interviews at all. And if they refused to be interviewed and just issued statements, then we would use those statements as part of the programme.
So that's where impeccable research is really critical, and having all those facts on a sheet at your fingertips. So if you forget that, if you're expecting them to not answer a question properly, you can refer back and say, yeah, but this happened, didn't it?
Yeah,
and those sorts of things.
You said something slightly different on that point, or whatever. Yeah, absolutely. And then you need the scientists. And again, we needed to make sure that we had a good science and people who could explain the likelihood of cloud seeding to a general audience. And then
that's all about getting them to explain it simply, isn't it? And what you find is you have to say, well, you sometimes have to play a bit dumb yourself and say, well, I don't really understand that. Can you find a simpler? How would you explain this if you were explaining it to your mum or your 12-year-old? And really, because they often again go into using too much jargon and you make it very technical.
Absolutely, you have to find their passion and get them to talk passionately. When they're starting to scribble things on envelopes, then you know you're getting somewhere. diagrams and pictures, and then you can get them to describe the pictures in a way that is very visual.
So moving on, we've got some other videos to watch that are more skills based, because this is more about the sort of what's got to go on in your head about preparing for an interview and the work you've got to do. This picture, Jane, tell us what that picture is of.
Ah, yes, the love seat, or the courting chair, or the conversation seat. Yes, so this to me says this is actually a very safe and secure way of getting the right distance between your contributor's mouth and your mouth when you're using your Zoom, which we're going to teach you how to use. You rest your elbow on. You are not invading that person's space, and yet you are getting close enough, this sort of width apart from their mouth, to get really good sound quality without too much mucking around going on from the background.
Yeah.
Yes, so they feel they're safe. They're in their little protected space, and you're looking at them, but there's a barrier between you, and the barrier also makes a fantastically solid mic stand to keep your elbow on. And
anyway, in Jane's video, you can watch the 21st century of the love seat, which was, of course, to enable people to have intense conversations without any risk of them touching each other. We've adapted that, and there's a video explaining that. And we've also got a video explaining how to use your microphone to record an interview, where we've introduced various microphones, including some that you can get to use with your phone, and also the Zoom recorders that UCL have. So lots more for you to do and watch for the rest of the week. And we look forward to seeing you at the seminar. Thank you.
Thank you.